Hey, how's it going? Real quick, before you start listening to the actual podcast, this is me talking to you after the podcast has been recorded. I just wanted to say, this one, as you can see by the runtime, goes on very long. I talk about a lot of stuff, a lot of it is tangents. So, since I care about your listening experience, I am going to go through and leave in the description below some timestamps about when I talk spoilers, when I don't talk spoilers, really, that's kind of it. That's all I'm going to mark. But, at least I'm doing something. Hello there, and welcome to Jake's Movie Tangents. That's right, folks. This recording, I did know the name, so, that's good. That's a step up. And, really, just off the bat, this is an interesting start, because before I started recording this exact episode, I had to decide how I wanted to, how I wanted to start, with the greeting. I went with hello there for many, many reasons. But I realized it's so easy after watching just so much YouTube and so many podcasts to start with, hey, what is up, guys? But that it's so fucking cliche. And so I thought of, what's up, guys? Or, how's it going, guys? And then I realized my voice is doing that same pitch kind of thing. The, hey, how's it going? Like, that kind of thing. So now I'm really trying to avoid that. So I went with hello there, a la Obi-Wan Kenobi, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Which is a little appropriate, actually, because we are talking about Dr. Sleep, starring Ewan McGregor.
You're magic. Like me.
I don't know about magic. I always called it The Shining.
Okay, Dr. Sleep. So, I was excited for this movie for such a multitude of reasons. Stanley Kubrick is my favorite director. Stephen King is my favorite author. And Mike Flanagan is one of my favorite directors, if not my favorite director working today. Because, obviously, Stanley Kubrick is not working today. Because he has been dead for over 20 years. May he rest in peace. But this was interesting because Mike Flanagan is really a lifelong Stephen King fan. So it's interesting that he's adapting King's sequel to The Shining because, if you know a thing or two about the 1980 Kubrick movie The Shining, you know that Stephen King is not a fan of that movie at all. It really takes a lot of liberties and steps away from King's novel, and King was, for understandable reasons, not stoked about that. That being said, though, The Shining is just, it's a masterpiece. Anybody who has just a knack for movies or a knack for horror would tell you The Shining really is just one of the best movies out there, and let me pull up the list real quick. But it is one of my favorite movies. I'll give you the precise ranking here. Like that sound? Okay. It's my 6th favorite movie. The Shining is my 6th favorite movie, according to my list here. So I'm a huge fan. So there was really no reason for me not to see this movie. I was super stoked for it. And I did something a little different going in, which is I read the book first. And let me tell you a bit about doing that. If you are primarily a movie person over a book person, you see more movies than books, you enjoy watching movies more than reading books, don't ever read the book first. I know everyone tells you, oh, you gotta read the book first, but no, don't read books before you see movies. This is gonna sound like such a shitty, unintelligent thing to say and really bad advice, but the thing is just, I think a big thing going into movies, having read the book first, is that movies have to keep a pace. You know, you're sitting, you're watching, you're paying attention to it, pretty much undivided attention to it for like 2.5 hours. And so it's got to keep your interest, so things constantly have to be moving. Whereas when you're reading a book, that's really done kind of in increments. You're reading some, you're taking a break, coming back later, reading more. I mean, I don't really know anybody who sits down and reads an entire novel in one sitting. So a book can really just delve into the details and have, you know, scenes that don't really move the plot forward, but really get you into the environment of the novel and get you acquainted with the characters. Sorry, I am a little bit sick. But yeah, so I mean that's obviously why books are like hundreds and hundreds of pages, and screenplays are like 100 flat, or a minute a page, whatever rule of screenwriting you subscribe to. And of course formatting, you know, a lot of spaces and indents in screenplays, but still, you know, movies have to be a lot faster paced than books, which is why people who, you know, read books more than they see movies, and they've always read the book first, are almost always disappointed with the movie adaptation, because they go in having read this story and they see a movie that, for obvious reasons, has to cut a whole lot of stuff out, for, you know, pacing reasons mostly, and then it feels kind of flawed. Now, that being said, I saw this movie almost a month ago. I got to see it 9 days before its wide release, because I'm better than you. No. But, yeah, I got to see it kind of early, and I had read a good portion of the book by then. I actually hadn't finished it before I saw the movie, so I don't know if I can really be like, I read the book first, but, I mean, I did read a lot of the book first. So, you know, there was moments when I was watching the movie, it's like, oh, okay, so this part's not going to happen, or, like, oh, man, that kind of developed a lot quicker than before. And then, I upon my first viewing of Dr. Sleep, I probably would have given it, like, a B+, maybe. I liked it. I was still just, I spent a lot of my first viewing kind of comparing it to the book almost throughout the movie, which is really not a good way to be watching a movie. You really just want to enjoy what you're watching and be invested in what you're watching, not constantly having your mind going, thinking about comparisons and shit. That's why I'm not a fan of the methods of a lot of, you know, modern day movie critics, not even modern day movie critics, but just movie critics in general. What they like to, you know, go in and take notes throughout the movie for their reviews, but your enjoyment of a movie, if you're taking notes throughout it, is automatically just going to be sliced the fuck in half. So, you know, best way to watch a movie is to just go in and just watch the movie that you're given, which is what I did yesterday when I rewatched Dr. Sleep, and I gotta tell you, I freaking loved Dr. Sleep the second time around. Like, I really liked it upon first watch, but there still was a part of me that was like, okay, well, like, these parts of the book were kind of rushed or not fleshed out, but it's like, no shit, I'm not watching a 10-hour movie, I'm watching a 2.5-hour movie, which is already a very generous runtime. But yeah, well, I watched it again last night, and I loved it. Probably between like an A or an A- for those of you who like to have quick grades. Let me talk about some things, non-spoilers to start, and then I'll get into spoilers, and I will warn you when I do, you little snob. And I just got a notification from my sound recording software that little portion was too loud. So I'll try not to rape the microphone as much. Okay. So, Dr. Sleep. Let's talk about it. So this is a sequel to Kubrick's version. This isn't just an adaptation of Stephen King's novel, Dr. Sleep. It is both an adaptation of that book and a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's version, which is already such a tricky place for writer, director, and editor Mike Flanagan to be in, because not only is he adapting the book, but he's also trying to make a sequel that, to a movie that was very different from its source material. So, obviously, King's book, Dr. Sleep, was a sequel to King's book, The Shining, which Flanagan is trying to adapt, yet at the same time he's making a sequel to Kubrick's The Shining, which is very different than King's The Shining, meaning he's already going to have to make certain changes to blend Kubrick and King. And I think you'll see this in almost every review you read for this movie. Mike Flanagan basically blends Kubrick and King perfectly in this movie. I feel like he would satisfy Kubrick fans and King fans to an equal degree very much. It is really kind of incredible, how well he satisfies both parties. And so for those of you who don't know, Mike Flanagan's body of work, he has directed all the episodes of the Netflix TV show Haunting of Hill House, which I think he's probably most known for. He's also directed Ouija, Origin of Evil, which was fantastic. I had not seen the first Ouija, but I've heard only bad things about it. But Ouija, Origin of Evil was incredible. He also directed Hush, which he wrote with his wife, Kate Siegel, and she also stars in it. And then he did this Netflix original called Before I Wake, which I would very highly recommend. That is a great movie. And then Oculus, which I think the other bulk of people would know him from. And Gerald's Game. That's another Stephen King adaptation. So he's done those. See how much you are familiar with, good old listener. He knows how to make a horror movie. But now that I say that, Doctor Sleep, I think, in a lot of ways does kind of what Exorcist 3 does and Aliens does, where it kind of does a genre change from the original. So, Kubrick's The Shining is a straight up horror movie. Whereas Dr. Sleep is more of a drama / thriller, because the bulk of the story is Danny Torrance, now 40-something years old, played by Ewan McGregor, who is fucking Ewan McGregor, so he's awesome. And it's about Danny Torrance pretty much trying to run away from his past and trying to overcome this alcoholism that he developed, in his early adulthood after, having to cope with so many fucked up memories from when he was 5. And so that's really the main part of what, the drama of the movie is about him trying to really just justify his even surviving The Shining. And that's something that kind of came up the second time I was watching it, is a lot of this movie is about, him questioning if he even really deserved to survive the events of the first movie. Because you look at Danny Torrance's life after he got out of the Overlook, and it's basically just alcoholism, depression, and bad choices. And so the story of this movie, which I'll get into in a sec, is really what brings him past that part of himself and what evolves him and tells him, yes, there is a reason you survived the events at the Overlook Hotel in 1980. And so that's, I thought that was really good, and that's really a compliment also just to Stephen King's book, because obviously the story's his. And then also the main story of this movie, again, spoiler-free, is this young girl named Abra Stone, and she has the Shining. She has that psychic ability, and there is this cult called True Knot, and they are a group of people that basically suck the Shining out of people by killing them very slowly and very painfully. By doing that, they get their Shining in the form of this kind of steam. They call it steam, and they like inhale the steam, and it ultimately helps them live longer. Like, the members of the True Knot are like hundreds and hundreds of years old, but the bulk of them look like they're in their early 30s. So they find out about this girl, and they're like, holy fuck, she's super powerful, because she is. She's like more powerful, more shiny, if you will, than a lot of people who have this ability. Again, so sorry for the sniffling. So they go after her, and meanwhile she kind of forms a psychic connection with Danny. He goes by Dan in this, because as you might know, The Shining is kind of like having a radio in your brain. That's part of it. And so she and Dan kind of pick up each other's signals a lot, so they kind of hold little conversations without even knowing each other or having ever met each other. Of course, eventually they do have to meet each other, because Abra starts to get worried about this group of people and what they're doing. After the events of one certain scene, which I'll get more into when I start talking spoilers, but there is a certain scene in this movie that is really hard to watch. I am a horror nut. Like, movies don't really scare me anymore, but this scene in particular was hard to watch, and I'm not gonna get into spoilers yet, as I've said like 8 times now, so shut up. But yeah, so there was one scene in particular that really stood out to me, just because it was just so perfectly crafted. I mean, from building suspense in such a very small amount of time, and then paying it off so heavily and so effectively, and some intercuts that they do, which I'll talk about later. It was just such a good scene, and it involves a young actor that some of y'all might be familiar with, named Jacob Tremblay, he's in Room with Brie Larson, that one movie that got Oscar nominations and wins. Brie Larson won for that. He's in Good Boys, that really vulgar middle school super bad, where it's like, oh, they're kids and they're swearing. I did like Good Boys, though. I liked that movie. He was also in Before I Wake by Mike Flanagan. So Flanagan and Tremblay, I guess, liked working for each other, because Jacob Tremblay had this small role. And in this small role, he sells just his part so well. And I don't think his performance in that one scene he was in, like, I think without that, the scene wouldn't have worked as well. And I think his acting ability in the scene in question was just really, really good and really dedicated, and that's what really helped sell it. Now, obviously, when I'm in a spoiler-free section, it's not great to just talk about one scene because you gotta spoil stuff. So I'm not yet. I'm gonna cover some other things and then get back to this. Let's talk about the villain, which is Rose the Hat, played by Rebecca Ferguson. Rose the Hat, that is a nickname that her character has because she always wears this kind of exotic, fancy top hat. And every member of this cult has a name like that. You got Rose the Hat, you got Barry the Chunk, Crow Daddy, Grandpa Flick, all kind of quirky names. But, the first time I saw the movie, I didn't really take in just how good a job Rebecca Ferguson does in this movie. Like, it's kind of amazing. She's like this really overly seductive, kind of sadistic woman who kind of gets all these people to follow her and do these bad things. I think primarily through seduction, physical seduction. And she kind of carries that vibe with her, and just like the way she talks and the way she carries herself and the way she clearly thinks of herself, like all small things that Ferguson adds to it. And then she's got like sort of an accent, and some people might be like, oh well, it's because she's British and she's trying to do an American accent, but it keeps slipping into British. I don't think that's it. I think it was very much intentional. For one, she's like actually hundreds of years old, so I don't think our modern American accent really existed hundreds of years ago, obviously. And also just the kind of grand royal view of herself kind of causes this very kind of transatlantic sounding voice. Transatlantic as in like the accent that actors in like the 30s through the 50s were trained to do, that kind of fake British and American combo that kind of meant you were an actress, which again is just sort of a good little statement about that character's ego. And yet she's different because in The Shining, you have a really kind of... I mean, some people will say, and this is kind of literally the correct answer, that the villain of The Shining, Kubrick's The Shining, not really the book, but the villain of Kubrick's Shining is basically Jack Nicholson. And it's him going crazy, being crazy, trying to murder his family, that thing. So it's really different to just kind of have this really attractive, kind of egotistical woman just kind of leading a bunch of people to do terrible things and be just so casual about it. Because like I said, they basically find children who have the Shining, and then by killing them slowly and painfully, they're able to suck that life out of them and kind of give it to themselves. So, that's a really different kind of villain, and I kind of have to credit Stephen King again in his book for changing really the story and the characters so much, and the atmosphere so much. Like, having a villain that's like a creepy hotel with ghosts and that's kind of a character in itself is obviously very different than having like a cult of quirky people hunting down children. But it really works, and Rebecca Ferguson does such a good job. Like, again, like it's just in so many small things that add up to just a really big, really good performance. And then also the actress of Abra, the girl, she's 12 in the movie. I don't know how old the actress is. Let me look up her name. I feel weird about just saying Rebecca Ferguson and Ewan McGregor and then not knowing this girl's name. Okay, Dr. Sleep. using IMDb. Is that Kylie Curran? I'm going to say Kylie Curran plays Abra Stone. And Mike Flanagan is good, clearly, at casting child actors because she is damn good in this movie. She's just so likable about not even I think where you grow attached to her is not through what she says and the dialogue that's written for her, which is good, but it's mainly through just I also said something similar about Rebecca Ferguson, but it's through how she carries herself and just she has such this happy kind of excited nature to her that's just really lovable. She's just like she's just nice to everybody. She's clearly genuinely excited to meet Danny when she meets him. She very differently from Danny when he was a 5-year-old is just very excited about this thing she could do. Danny was clearly scared by it, and he says many times in this movie that he is scared of his ability, but Abra's just like, she's excited about it. She's like, oh man, I can do this, to the point where she's to the point where she is pretty irresponsible with it at times. With great power comes great responsibility. Boom, Spider-Man quote, motherfucker. But yeah, that I think was a really good character move with her. So I really thought that Kylie Curran did a great job. Great child actor performance. I know child performances kind of go 50-50. I like to think, though, like, maybe in the past, 10 years, they've gotten better. Like, I'd say child performances are actually good most of the time. I think maybe there was just a period in the 90s where they were just consistently god-awful. I mean, really look at any child performance in 90s movies. It's not great. So yeah, props to her. Ewan McGregor. I haven't really talked much about Ewan McGregor in this movie other than I really like Ewan McGregor and that he's in the movie. But Ewan McGregor plays adult Danny Torrance, and he's really good. He brings a very quiet kind of feel to him. He's a very soft-spoken guy. He doesn't say things if he doesn't have to say them. Let me just X out of this. I don't know why that popped up on my computer. It's interesting because obviously Ewan McGregor, I say obviously a lot. Let me try to stop saying that. Ewan McGregor's a Scottish actor, so if you watch interviews with him or you've seen some of his movies, you'll hear him in his Scottish accent. If you know him from the Star Wars prequels, you'll kind of think he has a British accent, because Obi-Wan. And then he does American in this movie. And it's really different from his normal voice, but not unnaturally so. It works and it feels real. He just... every word he says... not that Ewan McGregor says, I guess, but what Danny, the character, says, it seems like Danny is so unsure about everything he says, and that's a good thing, because that's his character. He has such a damaged self-image, and I think Ewan McGregor did such a good job portraying that, and I think a great thing about his character arc in this movie is that his self-image kind of improves by a whole bunch of good deeds that he's consistently doing, to the point where he feels like he has made a positive impact and he has justified his survival of the events of The Shining, which was really good. But I mean, Ewan McGregor's just an awesome actor. You know, I think most people, including myself, or at least people around my age, were kind of introduced to him by the Star Wars prequels. But then I saw Trainspotting, which is my favorite movie, and he's in that, and he's just fucking awesome in that, and he's really just great in everything he does. So Yeah, looking forward to the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV series. And, I don't know, we'll see about Birds of Prey. Or the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, I think the title is. And the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. The title of that movie makes me want to throw myself out of this window here, which is kind of stupid because I'm on the first fucking floor. So, I'll maybe get a little cut from the glass. But yeah, Ewan McGregor's great in this movie, is the gist of this little tangent. Hence the podcast name. Okay, what else is there spoiler-free to talk about? Yeah, basically just don't go in to this movie expecting a horror movie. Don't go in expecting scare after scare after scare, because it's not that. This movie puts its drama before its scares, and I think that is what kind of puts a lot of people off, is they go in thinking, oh, it's a Shining movie, it's gonna just constantly be scary. But this movie's not really worried about that. It's worried about giving the story of Danny Torrance justice, and about Abra Stone, giving that story justice. So I would say it's more of a drama / thriller with some scary scenes, as I mentioned. So yeah, go in with the lens that it's drama, and I promise you will be more than satisfied with this movie. Now, finally, let's get into spoilers. Biggest thing I want to talk about right away. The actors who not reprise the roles, the actors that were cast to play the characters from the 1980 Shining movie. So young Danny, Wendy Torrance, and Jack Torrance, which that's why it's in the spoiler section, because they don't really let you know there's going to be a Jack Torrance. And if you are looking at the cast list on IMDb, Jack Torrance is mentioned dead last, probably to hide the fact that he's in the movie from people who haven't seen it. But I just remember there were some lines that the actress who played Wendy Torrance, who was trying to kind of do a Shelley Duvall performance or a Shelley Duvall impression, she was, wow. Like, if you were to close your eyes and like listen to the lines that she delivers, it's uncanny. It's kind of incredible. It's like to the point where it's like, did they just find stock footage of Shelley Duvall saying these things? But no, just the actress did a good job. I know that's mainly kind of a compliment to her voice, but I mean, I guess that kind of, it is. It's a compliment to her line delivery. Her line delivery was very good, very Shelley Duvall-ish. Duvall-ish. That sounds like a language. Huh. Okay. Ow. Just poked myself with something. Okay. And then young Danny was, I don't know, he was fine. He had like 3 lines. It's not really a thing that's even worth talking about. What I really want to talk about, what I'm excited to talk about, is Jack Torrance, because he's played by Henry Thomas, which is so fucking cool. For those of you who don't know, Henry Thomas is the main character from E.T., the little boy from E.T., who is now not a little boy, who's now like in his 40s. But he and Mike Flanagan are clearly buddies, because I think they first worked together on Ouija Origin of Evil, where Henry Thomas was like a really nice priest. He had a lot to do in that movie, and then he played like a creepy rapist father in Gerald's Game, and then he was the father. He was the dad in Haunting of Hill House, the dad when they were kids. That is, he was him. And then I was kind of surprised before I saw this movie. I was like, oh man, like Mike Flanagan didn't find a place to squeeze Henry Thomas in this movie. And then I saw the movie. And then there's kind of this recreation scene near the end where Danny's at that same bar where Jack Torrance sat and had that conversation with Lloyd, the bartender, and said the name Lloyd at least, I want to get this number right, like 40,000 times. It was a lot. But yeah, there's a scene where Danny is sitting across from some mysterious bartender, and you're like, oh, is he talking to Lloyd? But then he starts talking to him and calling him dad, and you're like, oh fuck, he's talking to Jack Torrance. And then it pans out, and it's Henry Thomas, but like with a little bit of makeup and he's changing his mannerisms so he looks like Jack Nicholson, and it's like, holy fuck. And I guess like I'm a cinema nerd, so it affects me a little more, but like Jesus, like that's fucking Henry Thomas. And I'd say Henry Thomas did like a pretty good job at doing Jack Nicholson too. Kind of, there are certain syllables that Jack Nicholson kind of leaned into when he was playing Jack Torrance that Henry Thomas definitely took note of and did the same, so that really helped with it. And then just the mannerisms, kind of a thing that Nicholson does with his eyebrows, they did, which actually, fun, stupid fact, a lot of people, due to the extreme nature of Jack Nicholson's eyebrows and how they kind of peak up, they thought that Jack Nicholson in The Shining was supposed to be a symbol, a representative of the Minotaur in Greek mythology, and that Danny and Wendy are in a labyrinth, and Jack is the Minotaur because of his eyebrows. Because of his fucking eyebrows is how they rooted that fucking theory. Which, if you want to laugh, just watch the documentary Room 237, where it's just a full-length documentary about people just making these ridiculous theories about The Shining. It's enjoyable. Yeah, so, Henry Thomas. There's more than that bar scene. You get, like, one other quick flashback of him chasing young Danny through the halls of the hotel. That was kind of cool, but, I mean, I thought the bar scene in this movie, some people might look at it and just be like, oh, it's fan service. They're just recreating The Shining. And I'm sorry, but if you watch that bar scene and that's all you get out of it, then I kind of feel like you just kind of turned your brain off for a bit there, because it's there's a lot going on in that scene, and a lot that's kind of comparing to the original scene that really adds to Danny's character, because in the original scene in The Shining, you have Jack Nicholson taking a drink after several months of trying not to take a drink and trying to get away from his alcoholism. Jack Torrance takes a drink, and now we have Danny in basically the same position, except he spent 8 years free of alcohol, except so many things are going wrong in his life now, and the fucking ghost of his father is offering him a cup of whiskey, and he turns it down, which is such a big thing for Danny's character, and it's such an expert way to show how Danny is ultimately different from his father, who he's desperate not to turn into. So that's basically the best way they could have used that bar scene, and the best way they could have really told the audience that, like, Danny has evolved. He is not gonna fall into drinking anymore. So that's really what I found that was going on with that bar scene. But a lot of people might just think, oh, they're doing similar shots in the same set, and Jack Torrance is there, boom, fan service, plugging my ears, la la la, I'm right, and that's that. So that's kind of what I thought about that scene. But yeah, so the movie ends, and they show this in the trailer. The whole kind of final act is in the Overlook Hotel, which they painstakingly had to recreate, and from what I read, Mike Flanagan had to get a bunch of blueprints from Kubrick's estate to recreate the sets plural, as accurately as possible, which they did a really good job of. And there was a scene, another one that could be just mistook for fan service, but this one I could kind of see why, because there's less going on thematically for this movie than, like, the bar scene, where there's probably about 4 minutes total of Danny just walking through all the sets from the original Shining, just walking through all the Overlook with, like, no music. It's just him walking through the Overlook, nothing really happens. So a lot of people might see that and be like, all right, they're just trying to get us excited. And maybe that might be part of it. But also a lot of it is setting up for scares that are going to happen in the latter part of this act. Because later on, what they do to end this movie, which I think a lot of King fans are going to be happy about, is basically the ending of Dr. Sleep, the movie, is the ending of Stephen King's The Shining, the book. Because in The Shining book, spoiling that now, it ends with Jack Torrance. Sorry, they're both named Jack, and fuck you. I'm sorry, I'm taking out needless anger on you, noble listeners. But it ends with Jack Torrance chasing Danny around the halls, and eventually Danny gets him to come back for a split second because Jack's clearly possessed by all the spirits of the hotel. Danny gets Jack to come back for a moment, and Jack's like, I love you, son, I always have, and it's like, oh, it's so touching. And then the spirits come back, and they repossess Jack, and then Danny goes, you haven't dumped the boiler yet today. And then Jack's like, oh, fuck, or possess Jack, and they go down, because while Jack was trying to kill his family, he didn't check the boiler, which is overheating, and then the hotel explodes, but not before Danny, Wendy, and Dick get out. But Jack dies, pretty much making sure that the spirits can't fix the boiler, ensuring that the hotel explodes and no one ever has to suffer from it again. In Kubrick's movie, Jack doesn't get that kind of redemption. Jack's just insane. He's not really possessed either. He's just crazy. And he's chasing down his family. He loses Danny in the maze. He freezes. The hotel just freezes over. It doesn't get exploded or ripped apart or anything. So it's still standing, which is why they go back. So then the ending of Dr. Sleep is Danny possessed by all the spirits of the Overlook chasing Abra through the halls. Then Abra kind of gets him to come back for a second as actual Danny. It's this quick heartwarming moment, and then Abra's all like, you turned on the boiler when you got here, and it's gonna fucking blow this place up. And then the spirits repossess Danny and are like, oh fuck, we gotta save the boiler. And it's what I just said. Danny goes down there, redeems himself, it explodes. The end. So basically, the movie Dr. Sleep ends exactly the same way that The Shining, Stephen King's The Shining, ends. So that's kind of how Flanagan satisfies both Kubrick and King, not by retconning anything from Kubrick's movie. For those of you who don't know, retcon means to go back and change something that was already previously established. It does not go back and change anything from Kubrick's movie and say, actually, this happened. He just twists his own movie so that it makes Kubrick's world mesh with King's world pretty flawlessly. And really, I had no problem with the fact that they ended Dr. Sleep, the movie, the way they did. I thought it was a really smart thing to do, and it was very effective, especially because they're kind of constantly running the thing that I talked about, where it's like, how similar is Danny to his father? And it's pretty much that Danny is, the good parts of his father. He's not like Kubrick's Jack Torrance. He's like King's Jack Torrance, who redeems himself. So that was really good in terms of his character. And, a lot of people kind of disregard character arcs and character work in movies these days. It's kind of, most people only think about how events affect the narrative story, not how the events affect the characters, which is why there's a lot of times in entire movies or like subplots in movies that are meant to change a character rather than the narrative, and people think it's just a waste of time because they don't pay attention to the character work. And I think that's something you really got to watch for, not just in Dr. Sleep, but in movies in general. If you think maybe something isn't affecting the overall narrative, see if it's affecting the character. And it probably is. Now, nothing like that really kind of happened in Dr. Sleep. It just kind of, there were some, like, there was no whole part of the movie that didn't progress the narrative but progressed Danny. It was more just those last bits of The Shining, kind of like the way they reference The Shining, that affects Danny's character. But if you're not looking at it as something to affect his character, you're just going to see it as fan service and think it's bad. But no, it's good. It is monumental for the character of Dan Torrance. Now, let's talk about that scene that I mentioned, spoiler-free, because that scene is basically, like, perfection for, like, a scary scene. So, it's Jacob Tremblay, who plays, like, a 10-year-old boy, and the True Knot cult abducts him because he has a little bit of The Shining. And then there's just this whole part where they bring him out into this little abandoned area, and they, like, tie him to some posts, and he's just bawling his eyes out. Like, he's fucking terrified. And for some reason, people just, like, in scenes where, like, kids are in jeopardy these days, even in, like, It and Stranger Things, and I love both of those, but kids in peril in those movies, they're really surprisingly, like, cool about it. Not like, oh yeah, who cares? They're very level-headed. They make logical decisions. They're like, okay, let's get out of this. Let's be brave. This kid, he's not like that. He's an 11-year-old kid who just got abducted by a bunch of people and taken to a place. He's crying his fucking eyes out the entire time. And, like, Jacob Tremblay just, he does such a good job just pulling you in and just breaking your heart over this kid that you really haven't gotten to know at all. He's just, you feel so bad for him. And then Rose bends down and pulls out, like, a little razor blade, and he's like, are you gonna hurt me? And she's like, yes. And then he starts crying even harder, and it's just so gut-wrenching. And then the movie really doesn't, even the book kind of held back in this scene. You only really get glimpses of the aftermath of this kid's murder. In the movie, you see them just slicing and dicing this fucking kid with knives and razor blades and shit. And Abra, who I talked about, she gets her kind of radio in her head, her Shining, caught up with his. So for a moment, she starts seeing and feeling exactly what he is seeing and feeling. And she freaks out, and it's this horrific intercut of him getting, like, gutted, and her suddenly in her bedroom feeling it and screaming, and it's just all this, like, horrible, just all these horrible events happening after such a good, like, build up and payoff of them driving him, like, the little boy up to that place and, like, getting him ready for it, and you know something dreadful is going to happen. And with these intercuts of just horrificness happening, it's truly just a beautiful payoff. So then there's all that going on, and then you cut to Danny, and then the word Red Rum just explodes onto his blackboard, and he falls out of his bed, and it's just like, holy shit, so much just happened. And like I had goosebumps. Like, I was almost shaking. It was such an effective scene. You really have to see it. I don't think me stuttering and messing up words and trying to tell you guys about it is really doing it justice. It's just a fantastic scene. So, props to Jacob Tremblay for, he's pretty much hit child stardom at this point. So, props to him for just taking such a small role, probably because he's friends with Flanagan, and just putting his all into this small role. I mean, I think he is really what made that scene. Another thing I wanted to talk about is, as I mentioned very briefly earlier, Mike Flanagan wrote and directed, and then he also edited. He edits his movies, which is really uncommon in mainstream Hollywood. You don't see a lot of directors editing their movies, which Flanagan does, and that's kind of one of the biggest standouts of this movie. Like I talked about kind of the brilliance of the intercuts in that one scene. He also does a lot of callbacks to The Shining, not through like scenes where it's like, whoa, The Shining, but it's my audio just peaked there. Where there's just lots of dissolves and like crossfades, which The Shining had a lot of that most movies don't have anymore, but he brought them back, which was really, really cool. Just the transitions that were very reminiscent of the original. It's a small thing, but it's something I did not miss. It's something I appreciated. So, yeah. What else is there to talk about here? Oh, yeah, the score by the Newton Brothers. The music was very interesting. So the Newton Brothers, they composed the soundtrack for Haunting of Hill House, and they're back doing Dr. Sleep. And a lot of what they did was, like, very kind of quiet redesigns of the score from The Shining, which was really effective. Like, I think the bulk of the score is just kind of like a shrill, high-pitched noise with a heartbeat going. And then there's also some alterations of, like, the main Shining theme, and I think there was a little alteration of, like, the scene, the music for the scene when Jack sees the old lady in the bathroom. So they really do a lot of subtle things that worked really well for just establishing the feel of the movie and letting you know that, like, it is still part of Kubrick's universe, and I enjoyed that. What else is there to speak of? Oh, yeah, one more quick thing. Fucking the girl who plays a character named Snakebite Andy in this movie, I found it very interesting because I felt like she looked familiar. By the way, she plays like this girl who baits like these kind of sexual predators into going on dates with her, and then she like uses her Shining ability to like hypnotize them into doing bad things. As in bad things like making them admit doing good things, bad things for the guys. Things that would be bad for them. So, like, she'll hypnotize a guy who's, like, 50 but saw her dating profile online and agreed to go out with her even though she's only, like, 15. She hypnotizes them and makes it so, like, every time they think of her, they say out loud, "I like little girls," stuff like that. She really looks like she's, like, 20 or 21 in this movie, but she looked familiar, so I looked into who she was. And she was in the Netflix original movie called The Babysitter, which was, I think it's like 3 years old now, and she played like an 11-year-old in that movie. And she pretty much looked that age too. So she aged like 10 years in 3 years to me. Because logic. And by the way, that is not an insult. That is a compliment. Because aging at this point in your life is a compliment, okay? If you're fucking 15 and someone says, "Oh, you look like you're 20," that's a compliment, okay? Shut up. Don't be like, "Oh, I look so old." No, okay? Because when you are 20, you are in, like, the prime of your life. So if you're 15 and someone says you look 20, that's a compliment, all right? It's not like if you're 50 and someone goes, "Oh, you look 90." That's a whole different thing. It's not at all the same thing. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting that she, like, Google pictures of this actress. Fucking, let me pull up her name because I can't just talk about her and tell you to look her up and not tell you who she is. All right, you might want to, I don't know how to pronounce this. You might want to just look up the cast list of the movie. It's the actress who plays Snakebite Andy, Emily Aylin Lind. That's her name. She looks like she's 21 in this movie, and then in The Babysitter, which is 3 years old, she looks like she's 11. So that was very interesting to me. That was a big surprise for me to figure out. I should probably wrap this up because this is going on very long. Sorry about that. Thank you if you are still listening. Stay tuned for more very long rambles and tangents about movies that I see in theaters, and maybe sometimes movies that aren't in theaters but I just want to talk about. Please have a good day. I'm out of here.